I am Monique, and I have spent all 32 years of my life as the designated disappointment of my family. My presence has always been treated like a footnote in the grand story of the Whitfield success, and this annual trip to Hilton Head was proving to be the final chapter in my book of patience. I had just flown into the island for our yearly gathering and was standing in the middle of a 5-star resort lobby that felt more like a museum than a hotel. My sister Simone looked at me with a smirk that told me she had been rehearsing her cruelty for weeks. She announced with a sharp voice that they had reserved rooms only for the real family, which included her and her husband and her child, but left no space for me. I looked at my parents hoping for a shred of defense, but Lorraine and Charles just stared at the floor as if the patterns in the marble were the most fascinating things in the world. They clearly expected me to break down into tears or fall to my knees and beg for a spot on a sofa, but they did not know the woman I had actually become. Instead of giving them the satisfaction of my misery, I calmly approached the concierge and asked for the most expensive presidential suite in the building, paying for it with an American Express black card that they never even knew I possessed. I walked away from their confused stares and began silencing their frantic phone calls because they truly believed they were shaming a failure of a daughter. They had absolutely no idea that in just a few hours they would be the ones on their knees begging me to use my secret connections to save my nephew's life. The lobby of the Sanctuary Resort was a monument to old money wealth, where cool marble floors reflected chandeliers that dripped with crystals like frozen rain. I felt the heavy South Carolina humidity clinging to my skin as I dragged my simple canvas suitcase across the polished stone, and the rattling sound it made seemed to offend the very air. I was exhausted from a long flight and arrived 3 hours late to find my family clustered near the check-in desk, looking like a perfect portrait of upper-class success. My father Charles was 60 years old and looked imposing in a golf polo so expensive it probably had its own zip code, while my mother Lorraine was 58 and looked elegant in a white linen dress as she tapped impatiently on her phone. My sister Simone was 30 years old and was the glittering center of her own universe, laughing as her husband Ryan whispered in her ear. Ryan was 31 and was the definition of East Coast preppy with white skin that stood in stark contrast to the rest of my family. Their 3-year-old son Jadon was dangerously close to knocking over a potted palm near their mountain of expensive Louis Vuitton luggage. When I finally reached them, my throat was tight with the familiar anxiety that always came before a family event. I whispered an apology for being late due to maintenance issues on my flight from D.C., but my mother just gave me a sigh of weaponized disappointment. She did not even look up from her screen as she told me I was always the last one, and that I had kept the entire family waiting while my father grew impatient. Simone turned her smile into a look of assessment as she scanned my simple black travel outfit and told me she was half sure I would not be able to afford the flight on my little save-the-world job. Ryan chuckled and told her to be nice because I was trying my best, but his condescension felt even worse than her open cruelty. They called my job at Tech for Hope a little charity and imagined me handing out old laptops in a church basement for minimum wage. They never bothered to ask what I actually did or about the complex algorithms and logistics platforms I was building, because it was easier for them to write me off as a failure. My father finally turned away from the bellhop and gave me an appraisal instead of a welcome, telling me I was disorganized before dismissing me to check in. He announced his name to the concierge, and Simone watched me with profound boredom as she made sure the staff could hear her say she was surprised I made it at all. Ryan wrapped an arm around her and gave me a patronizing smile while they pictured me living in cardigans and eating lentils in a tiny apartment. They never asked about the multi-million-dollar grants I secured or our international government contracts because they needed me to be the pity case to make their own lives feel more valid. My father cut off any response I might have had because his patience had snapped, and he told us to just get checked in because everyone was tired. He turned his back on me to command the full attention of the concierge, and the message was clear that I was dismissed from the conversation. He announced he had a reservation for 2 suites, and the staff confirmed 1 oceanfront suite for my parents and an adjoining junior suite for Simone's family. I stepped forward and placed my purse on the counter, asking for the 3rd room under the name Monique Whitfield. The concierge searched the system, but her smile faltered as she told me there were only 2 reservations associated with the party. There was no 3rd room booked in my name, and the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The background noise of the lobby seemed to fade away as a rushing sound filled my ears, and I realized this was not a mistake but a deliberate decision. Ryan had a cruel smirk, and Simone was studying her nails, while my mother found the floor fascinating, and my father stared out the window. He had left me alone to be humiliated in public, and his rigid back was all the answer I needed. My mother finally broke the silence in a breezy voice, as if she were talking about the weather, and said she assumed I would book my own room since I was 32, and the trip was expensive. I was stunned because for 15 years our parents had always handled the family bookings. My father added that they had to prioritize Simone and Ryan because they were a real family with a child and needed more consideration. He told me I was just one person who was alone and could handle it, and instructed me not to complicate things. The humiliation was so sharp it was hard to breathe, and the concierge looked at me with genuine pity as she mentioned they only had a parking lot view or the presidential suite left. She clearly expected me to take the cheap room because she saw the failure my family wanted her to see. Simone let out a sharp, cold laugh and leaned against Ryan for support as she mocked me for being so literal. She stepped forward and told me again that rooms were for the family, meaning her husband and her child, because they were a real unit. Ryan added that family units like theirs had more requirements and suggested I find a motel 6 down the highway because it would be adequate for a single woman with a flexible lifestyle. His words were like a physical slap, and the look on Simone's face showed she was savoring every second of this planned public declaration that I did not belong. I stood there motionless as their laughter echoed in the opulent lobby, and a hot, furious blush crept up my neck. This was a statement of deliberate shame, and I remembered how they had dismissed my coding achievements last Thanksgiving to talk about Ryan's car. I remembered how they gave them ski trips to Aspen for Christmas while I got a simple sweater because they were a destination and I was just an obligation. I had spent my life trying to earn their approval while building a company from scratch, but I was still just the disorganized charity worker to them. The anger that had been simmering for 20 years finally began to burn in my chest as my mother told me not to make a scene and embarrass the family. She told me to be reasonable and find a standard room so I wouldn't ruin their vacation over a little booking mix-up. I looked at their smug faces, and something inside me finally snapped as a cold, sharp calm took over. I stood up straight, and the exhaustion vanished as I focused all my attention on the stunned concierge. I told her I was sorry for the confusion and that the presidential suite sounded lovely and that I would take it for 3 nights. The silence that followed was absolute as Simone made a choking sound and Ryan's smug expression vanished. My mother gaped at me and Simone shrieked, asking where I got that kind of money or if I had taken out more loans. I did not look at them as I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek jet black card made of titanium. I placed the American Express Centurion card on the marble counter with a definitive thud and watched the concierge's pity turn into reverent respect instantly. She processed the payment for the $5,000 a night suite, and I felt my father's gaze as he recognized the card he had been trying to get for years. I had just slapped down the ultimate status symbol that he could never acquire, and I did it like it was nothing. I requested a private car service immediately and turned to face my family, who were frozen in disbelief. I told them they were right and that I would not want to ruin the real family's trip, so I was leaving to handle my own arrangements. My father exploded in rage, telling me to stop the performance, but I laughed and reminded him that abandoning his daughter was what was truly embarrassing. I told my mother I was done making things complicated and turned my back on all of them as the staff treated me like royalty. I walked toward the glass doors and left my simple suitcase as an orphan next to their mountain of luggage because I knew I didn't need it. Every step away from them felt powerful as my father roared for me to come back, but I kept walking and pushed through the revolving door into the humid air. My phone buzzed with his name, but I pressed the decline button and felt the first real breath of air I had taken all day as a gleaming black Maybach pulled up to the curb to take me away. I stood under the grand portico of the resort and felt the heavy warmth of the South Carolina air, which was a strange contrast to the icy chill I had left behind in the lobby. My phone began to vibrate relentlessly in my hand as a series of notifications lit up the screen with the inevitable fallout of my departure. I did not look down to answer their calls, but I read the cascade of panic and rage that was pouring in from my family members. First, there was a text from my father Charles, who demanded to know what I thought I was doing and ordered me to get back inside the hotel right at that moment. His words were a command, as if I were still a rebellious teenager and not a 32-year-old woman he had just publicly disowned in front of a crowd of strangers. I read his message and felt absolutely nothing as I deleted it from my device. The phone buzzed again immediately with a message from my mother Lorraine, who claimed I was making a terrible scene and that everyone in the lobby was staring at them. She begged me to stop being so selfish and to come back inside because I was embarrassing my father. These were the same words like selfish and embarrassing that she had used my entire life to control me and make her own feelings my responsibility while shaming me back into the tiny box she had designed for me. I deleted her message too. Then came a vibration from Simone, who asked if I was serious with that fake credit card and added a laugh out loud while asking who I was trying to impress. She told me my father was furious and that she could not wait to see how long I could keep up this rich girl act before I came crawling back to them. She finished by telling me that I would always be a failure, and that word failure had been her favorite weapon for years, and it usually hit its mark. I stared at that word on the screen, and for a fleeting second the old familiar sting of worthlessness pricked at my heart. But then I looked up and saw a car pulling up to the curb that was not a taxi or a standard ride-share vehicle. It was a Maybach S-Class, which looked like a silent black phantom of a car and was so polished that it resembled liquid night. It was longer than a standard sedan and represented the very picture of discreet and undeniable wealth as it glided to a stop directly in front of me with an engine that sounded like a low, powerful purr. My phone buzzed again with a message from Lorraine asking what that car was, and if I had called a limo while reminding me that I could not afford such a thing. I silenced the phone completely and slipped it into my pocket as the back door of the Maybach was opened from the outside by a professional chauffeur in a sharp dark uniform. He was a true professional who stepped onto the curb with perfect posture and nodded respectfully at me as he welcomed me. I nodded and moved to get into the back seat as he informed me that Mr. Marcus was waiting for me at the villa. The interior of the car was absurdly luxurious and smelled of rich leather and polished wood. The door closed with a soft, heavy thud that instantly sealed out the sounds of the resort and the frantic energy of my family. There was only silence as the car pulled away from the curb so smoothly that it felt more like floating than driving. I did not look back because I did not need to see them. I could feel their eyes on the car as we disappeared down the long driveway lined with palm trees. Inside the lobby, my family stood frozen while staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the disappearing tail lights of the Maybach. The bellhops, who were still holding their mountains of luggage, looked awkwardly between the family and the door. Ryan was the first to speak with a disbelieving stammer as he recognized the car as an S-Class with a private chauffeur. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and asked what the hell was going on and how I had obtained such a vehicle. My father said nothing as he stood perfectly still with a face that was a mask of cold fury and hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles were white. He had not understood the black card entirely, but he understood the car and the power it represented. He hated that it was a display of wealth he had not orchestrated and could not control. He had no idea what was happening, and that uncertainty made him more furious than anything else. Simone recovered from her shock and reached for the only explanation that made sense in her narrow world. She scoffed and tossed her hair with renewed scorn as she claimed it was obvious that I must have a rich boyfriend or some tech billionaire I had latched onto. She looked at Ryan and her parents for agreement while calling it typical of me to need a rescue from a man. She laughed that same sharp, cruel sound and suggested I was probably just a mistress who was pretending to be something I was not. Lorraine seized on this explanation and nodded eagerly while agreeing that I could never afford such a life on my own. The idea that I had achieved this success myself was so impossible to them that it did not even occur to their minds. The Maybach drove for 20 minutes and left the public grounds of the resort far behind until the chauffeur turned onto a private, unmarked road and pressed a code into a discreet keypad. A set of high modern security gates swung open silently to grant us access to a lush private forest draped in Spanish moss. I had no idea this part of the island even existed as the road opened up to a stunning cliffside view. The car stopped at a sprawling modern villa made of dark wood and glass that was built directly into the bluff and seemed to float over the Atlantic Ocean. It was so private and architecturally significant that it made my family's 5-star resort look like a common chain hotel. The chauffeur opened my door and told me Mr. Thorne was on the main terrace. I walked through a massive open-air living room where the glass walls had retracted to let the sea breeze flow through, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. The space was filled with minimalist art, and I finally saw Marcus standing by an infinity pool that seemed to melt into the horizon. At 45, he was the picture of understated power and looked like a strategist who saw the entire chessboard while others were just looking at the next move. He turned as I approached and broke into a warm, genuine smile that held no judgment. 2 glasses of expensive red wine were already poured on a table between 2 deep lounge chairs. He remarked that he took it the family reunion did not go smoothly, and I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since I stepped off the plane. I sank into one of the chairs as my anger and adrenaline gave way to a profound bone-deep weariness. I picked up the wine, which was a complex and comforting Bordeaux, and told him it was much worse than I had anticipated. He did not pry, but just waited for me to speak in his usual supportive way. I told him they did not even book a room for me, and just left me standing in the lobby. I laughed a humorless, broken sound as I described how my father looked away while my mother told me to be reasonable. I told him how Simone said they had to prioritize the real family and how they told me to find a Motel 6. Marcus took a slow sip of his wine and let out a low, humorless laugh at the mention of the motel. He noted that they really had no idea and still saw me as a struggling charity worker at my little pity project. I looked down into my wine and told him they did not know the truth because they never bothered to ask. They had no idea that Tech for Hope was not just a nonprofit I worked for, but was actually our foundation. That was the secret I had kept for 6 long years while my family categorized me as a failure. Tech for Hope provided resources to underserved communities, but it was also the philanthropic arm of Oratech, which was the company I had built from the ground up with Marcus. 6 years ago, while they were planning Simone's wedding, I was in a garage in Palo Alto writing the foundational code for the company. I was the co-founder and the chief technology officer known to the tech world as the anonymous genius M. Thorne. I was the architect behind an artificial intelligence platform that managed secure logistics for the largest corporations and governments in the world. While my father bragged about regional contacts, I was quietly negotiating contracts with the Department of Defense. After our latest contract, the company valuation was finalized at $1.2 billion, and my 40% stake made me one of the youngest self-made women in the industry. I had kept this truth hidden because I wanted to see if they could love me without the validation of my money. I wanted to know if my father could ever be proud of Monique the daughter rather than Monique the executive. The scene in the lobby had been a clear and brutal answer of no. Marcus looked at me with an expression that softened from irony into a familiar kind of brotherly concern, as he asked if I still had not told them the truth after everything that had happened. I shook my head while staring out at the endless twilight of the ocean, and felt the cool salt spray on my face as I admitted that I had truly intended to tell them during this trip. I had spent months picturing a family dinner where I would calmly explain the existence of Oratech and the billion-dollar valuation, not to boast but simply to finally be seen as a person of substance. I had nursed a fantasy that if I showed them proof of my success, my father might finally look at me with the same pride he reserved for Ryan's real estate deals or Simone's domestic life. I took a shaky sip of my wine and confessed that I just wanted to know if they could respect me as Monique the daughter, rather than Monique the billionaire. I had stayed silent because I was terrified that any affection they showed after knowing the truth would be based on my bank account rather than my character. I was even more afraid that if I never told them, they would continue to view me as a failure forever, but the joke was ultimately on me because the test I designed was one they failed spectacularly without even knowing they were taking it. The rejection in the lobby and the suggestion of a Motel 6 was my definitive answer, and the hope I had carried for 32 years finally died right there. As if summoned by the finality of my thoughts, my phone began to buzz relentlessly on the stone table, and I saw my mother's name lighting up the screen. She was calling out of a sense of panic and desperation because I had defied her and disrupted the perfect family image she worked so hard to maintain. I looked at her name and pictured her face of impatient disapproval before I deliberately held the power button until the screen went black and the phone became a useless piece of glass. I told Marcus that I was going to enjoy my vacation, and at that same moment back at the Sanctuary Resort, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Inside their ocean front suite, Lorraine was pacing the expensive carpet, while Simone and Ryan sat stiffly on a silk sofa, whispering frantically. My father Charles stood by the window with a rigid back radiating a cold fury that had lasted the entire elevator ride. He finally turned with a mask of controlled rage and ordered them to stop whispering before barked at Ryan to get his laptop. Ryan scrambled to retrieve the device and sat at the ornate desk as my father demanded to know everything about the Maybach and the man named Marcus. For several minutes, the only sound was the clicking of keys and my mother's shallow breathing until Ryan announced that the car was registered to a corporate entity called Oratech Holdings, LLC. My father repeated the name, and Ryan began typing even faster until he suddenly stopped and turned the screen around with a look of total shock. He revealed that Marcus Thorne was the founder and CEO of Oratech, which was a private defense and logistics giant that had just signed a $1.7 billion contract with the Pentagon. The room fell silent as Simone gasped and realized that the Oratech Foundation was the primary funding source for Tech for Hope. My mother whispered that it was my little charity, and Simone corrected her by saying it was actually Marcus Thorne's charity and that I was connected to him. Lorraine wondered aloud why I would keep such a secret, and my father slammed his hand down on the desk in a roar of fury. He claimed I was manipulative and had been playing them the whole time while laughing at their expense. Simone tried to tell herself that I was just an executive assistant or a mistress because she could not fathom any other reality. While they spiraled into bitterness, Marcus and I were at a restaurant called The Tides, which was a 3-star Michelin establishment located in a private cove. The dining room was intimate and looked out over an ocean bathed in moonlight, as the sound of the surf provided a rhythmic backdrop to our dinner. Marcus had secured the best table in the house, and we were discussing the expansion into Frankfurt and a new logistics algorithm that would dominate the European market. We clinked our glasses as partners, who trusted each other implicitly, and we were comfortable discussing billion-dollar strategies with total ease. It was during this moment of confidence that I felt eyes on me, and I used the reflection in the glass wall to see Simone and Ryan sitting at a small, awkward table near the service entrance. They had clearly pulled strings just to continue their surveillance of me, and they were pretending to read menus while staring at Marcus with pure envy. They looked like cheap costume jewelry in such a refined environment because they were trying too hard to look wealthy, while Marcus and I simply were. I smiled and continued my conversation about server capacity while ignoring the heat of my sister's stare. Halfway through the main course, a shadow fell over our table, and I saw Simone standing there with white knuckles and a face flushed with fury. She hissed that she did not know what game I was playing, but that I was making the whole family sick with worry. I slowly placed my fork down and took a sip of wine while letting the silence stretch to make her uncomfortable under the gaze of the other diners. I finally looked at her and told her that I was not playing a game, but simply following the rules they had set in the lobby by taking care of myself as my father suggested. Marcus stood up, and his commanding presence immediately threw Simone off balance as he introduced himself and said he had heard so much about her. Simone sneered and asked how much he paid me to afford a black card and a Maybach trying to paint me as a kept woman. Marcus let out a soft, ironic laugh and told her she had misunderstood everything because I did not work for him. He revealed that we were partners who built the company together and that I was the chief technology officer and the actual brain behind the operation. The blood drained from Simone's face as she sputtered that it was impossible because I was the failure who went to a state college. I leaned forward and corrected her by stating that I had graduated from MIT with honors in computer science, but she had forgotten because she was too busy choosing a wedding dress. I told her she had written me off because I did not fit her narrative and that I had kept my life private to see if they could ever love me unconditionally. I finished my wine and told her that their behavior in the lobby gave me the only answer I needed. Marcus added the final blow by mentioning that my 40% stake in Oratech was officially valued at $1.2 billion. Simone physically stumbled backward, and her face went completely white as the word billion exploded in the silence. I told her to go back to her table and report the truth to our parents before I took a calm bite of my perfectly cooked scallop. Simone stumbled away with jerky movements and collapsed into her chair while whispering the numbers to a stunned Ryan. They realized with horror that they had told a billionaire to stay at a Motel 6, and Ryan immediately threw cash on the table so they could run out and tell my father the news. They burst into the suite, and Simone shouted the truth while Charles dropped his phone in shock. The reaction was explosive as my father swept a glass off the bar in a fit of rage because he felt I had made them look like fools. My mother, however, collapsed into sobs because she finally realized they had treated their own daughter like garbage and that their arrogance had cost them everything. The following morning arrived with a brightness and clarity that stood in stark contrast to the emotional storm of the previous night. I was miles away from the sanctuary resort and the toxicity of my family while sitting on the sun-drenched upper deck of the Oratech corporate yacht, which was named the Aura. This vessel was less of a boat and more of a floating high-tech command center that was equipped with secure satellite internet and holographic data displays to keep us connected to our global operations. Marcus and I were already deep into our work with our laptops open and spreadsheets and complex code glowing on the screens in front of us. The ocean was perfectly calm, and a light breeze carried the fresh scent of the sea, which made the environment incredibly peaceful. My personal phone, which I had retrieved from the presidential suite and finally charged, suddenly began to ring and shattered the morning quiet. I looked down at the screen and saw the name Charles, and Marcus glanced at me with a knowing look as he remarked that the call was arriving right on schedule. I nodded and took a deep breath before answering the call and pressing the speakerphone button so the phone sat on the table between us. A voice that I barely recognized as my father's flooded the deck, but it was dripping with a thick and fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. He called out my name with a tone of performative affection and asked if I was there. He referred to me as his love and claimed that he and my mother had been sick with worry while calling all night long because they were afraid something had happened to me. He mentioned that Ryan had told them what I had accomplished and claimed they were just floored by the news. I looked at Marcus, who was calmly sipping his coffee with eyes that revealed his deep amusement at the situation. Charles continued with a voice thick with regret and called them absolute fools for their behavior the night before while claiming they were just in shock. He said they should have been proud of me and insisted that they were incredibly proud of their daughter. I finally picked up the phone and kept my voice as calm and flat as the ocean in front of us as I cut him off. I asked him a very direct question about whether he was proud of me, or if he was actually just proud of my $1.2 billion. The fake warmth on the other end of the line died instantly, and there was a heavy loaded silence as I pictured him trying to navigate his way through this confrontation. He finally told me not to talk like that and tried to recapture a loving tone while claiming we were family and that they loved me. He said the money was just a wonderful bonus and a testament to my hard work, and that they simply wanted to celebrate their daughter. I let the offer hang in the air for a moment, while the sound of small waves lapping against the yacht's hull filled the silence. He insisted that I come back to the resort right away so they could cancel their plans and throw a massive celebration with all their friends and the whole family to show everyone how proud they were. The hypocrisy of his words was so thick that I could barely breathe as I realized they only wanted to celebrate me now that I was a billionaire. I politely but coldly declined his offer and told him I was not interested in a party. He sputtered in confusion as the fake cheer evaporated, and I told him I had actual work to do. I reminded him that I had been doing this work for the last 6 years while they all thought I was a failure. I added with a dropping voice that I had absolutely no desire to celebrate anything with the people who had abandoned me in a hotel lobby less than 24 hours ago. He told me not to be dramatic and claimed it was just a misunderstanding, but before I could respond, I heard a scuffle on the other end. My mother's voice burst through the phone as she was high-pitched and frantic after clearly grabbing the phone from him. Lorraine cried out that I could not mean what I was saying and begged me to forgive them for their terrible mistake. She told me I had to help them because I was family and because I had everything and all this money now. Her voice broke, and I heard her whisper to my father that he had to tell me the truth right now. There was another muffled sound before my father's voice returned to the line, but all the fake warmth and blustering anger were gone. It was replaced by a sound of desperation that I had never heard from him before. He told me his company was in serious trouble, and I waited in silence as he explained that an audit had gone very badly. He admitted to making bad investments and leveraging assets to cover his tracks, but the point was that he was in serious debt, and the bank was calling his loans. He confessed that he was going to lose everything, and I closed my eyes as I realized it was never about pride or humiliation. It was only about the money. He stammered that he needed a significant loan just to get through the crisis and reminded me that I was his daughter and could help him. So there it was as the real reason for the call and the fake apologies, and the sudden pride became clear. They did not see a daughter they had wronged, but instead they saw a financial solution and a bank. I finally spoke with a quiet and dead voice as I acknowledged that the real reason for the contact was that he needed my money. I did not wait for his answer and simply ended the call while staring at the black and silent screen of my phone. The sound of his desperate pleading still echoed in the quiet air of the yacht deck as I whispered to Marcus that I could not believe what had happened. I let out a sharp and bitter laugh as I admitted that I actually thought for a second he was calling because he felt ashamed of his actions. I shook my head at my own naivety as I realized he was not ashamed, but was instead just calculating a new angle. Marcus said gently that I should not be surprised because this was who they had always been, and I just had a higher price tag now. I felt the anger rising hot and sharp as I noted that he did not even try to pretend he cared about me for more than 30 seconds before seeing me as a walking, talking ATM. I stood up, too agitated to sit, and walked to the railing of the yacht to grip the cool metal while staring at the water. I could not believe he had the nerve to ask for a loan after abandoning me and letting Simone and Ryan treat me like I was nothing. The full weight of their actions, from the Motel 6 comment to calling me a failure, slammed back into me and was compounded by this greedy plea. I seethed that they were unbelievable and completely devoid of any decency. My words were suddenly cut off by the sharp metallic ringing of Marcus's private satellite phone, which was reserved for high-level emergencies. Marcus was instantly alert and answered before the second ring, and his relaxed posture vanished as he went ramrod straight. The color drained from his face as he asked where and when it happened, and he began pacing a tight circle on the deck while asking if someone was stable. He ended the call with a mask of grim seriousness and told someone we would be there in 20 minutes. He looked at me, and my heart began to pound as a sudden cold dread washed over me. I whispered to ask what happened, and Marcus hesitated with eyes full of pain as he told me there had been an accident at the resort. I asked if it was my mother or father, but Marcus stepped toward me with a somber expression. He told me it was my nephew Jadon, and that the 3-year-old had fallen from a balcony on the 3rd floor and landed on the concrete pool deck below. The yacht raced back to the private dock with a sense of urgency that made the water churn in our wake. The chauffeur was already waiting with the engine of the Maybach running, and the 20-minute drive to Hilton Head Hospital passed in a silent, high-speed blur. Marcus remained on his phone, making rapid calls in a low and urgent voice as he arranged logistics that my numb mind could not even begin to process. I just stared out the window thinking of 3-year-old Jadon and the little boy who shared my sister's eyes. We burst through the automatic doors of the emergency room, which felt stark and sterile while smelling of antiseptic and fear. I saw my family huddled in a small private waiting nook, and they looked completely shattered and unrecognizable. My mother Lorraine sat ramrod straight on a vinyl chair with her white linen dress now rumpled and stained with tears as she held Simone. Simone was collapsed against her and was letting out a raw animalistic sound of pure agony. Ryan was a total wreck, with his expensive shirt untucked and his hair matted with sweat as he paced in a frantic circle, muttering "no" over and over again. My father Charles was slumped against the wall with a face that had turned a shocking ashen gray, and he looked 100 years old with all his authority gone. Lorraine was the first to see me and cried out my name with a desperate and shocking sense of relief. However, before she could speak, Simone pushed herself away from our mother and stood up with a face destroyed by tears and mascara. When her eyes locked on mine, they were not filled with grief, but with pure, unadulterated hatred. She hissed a venomous whisper that echoed in the small room and pointed a shaking finger at me while screaming for me to get out. She asked if I was there to mock them, and then shrieked that the entire accident was my fault. I recoiled and staggered back as if she had physically struck me because the word fault seemed to echo in the fluorescent-lit corridor. I whispered a question of how it could be my fault when I was miles away on a yacht trying to escape them. Simone shrieked that we were all fine until I made that phone call and claimed that my father and mother were devastated after I hung up on them. She yelled that my parents were a mess and that she and Ryan went for a walk on the beach for just 10 minutes because they needed a break from the fighting. She sobbed that they left Jadon with my parents in the suite and that Charles and Lorraine were supposed to be watching him. She claimed they were distracted because they were fighting about me and my money and my selfishness. She sobbed that Jadon climbed over the balcony railing while they were busy arguing, and then she spat that if I had not upset them, this never would have happened. The accusation was monstrous and was a twisted attempt to shift the blame for their own catastrophic negligence onto me. I felt the world tilt and my knees buckle, but Marcus put a steadying hand on my arm to keep me upright. My father finally told Simone to be quiet, but his voice was rough and choked as he stared at the floor. He seemed terrified of the truth of their failure being screamed in public. Before I could defend myself, the heavy double doors to the trauma bay swung open, and a doctor in blue scrubs stepped out. Dr. Evans looked grim and exhausted as he asked for the family of Jadon Whitfield. The toxic bubble of our drama evaporated and was replaced by a sharper terror as Ryan and Charles surged forward. They pleaded for information, and the doctor told them that Jadon was alive and stabilized for now. A collective sigh of relief went through the family, but the doctor noted that the fall was significant and resulted in a severe traumatic brain injury with significant swelling. He added that there was a high cervical spine fracture, which meant the fall had severely damaged the spinal cord at the base of the neck. He stated the situation was critical and they needed to relieve pressure on the brain and spinal cord immediately. My father told him to get Jadon into surgery and said he would pay whatever it cost. Dr. Evans shook his head and explained that Hilton Head General was not equipped for this specific and highly specialized procedure. He said they did not have the pediatric neurosurgical microsurgery equipment or the specialist required for such a delicate operation. He noted there were only 5 surgeons in the country who could do it, and that the leading expert was Dr. Alistair Reid at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Ryan demanded they get a helicopter or plane to move Jadon, but the doctor said it required a fully equipped critical care medevac jet with a pediatric trauma team. He also warned that Dr. Reid's protocol was considered experimental and was profoundly out of network for their insurance. My father boomed that he would write a check, but the doctor explained that the medevac company and the hospital would not even start their engines without payment in full upfront. He estimated the total prepaid cost for the flight and the surgery at $1.5 million. The number hung there like an impossibility, and Ryan stopped moving while staring at the doctor in total shock. My father Charles just deflated and his shoulders slumped because he knew his accounts were frozen and he was publicly powerless. Simone crumpled to the floor and whispered that they did not have that kind of money. Ryan looked at his own hands as if they had betrayed him because all his commissions were locked in escrow and he was useless. Simone screamed at her father to pay, but Charles admitted with a rattling whisper that he could not because of the audit. He confessed it would take weeks to access money, and the doctor said they only had 3 or 4 hours at most before the damage became permanent or worse. Simone let out a primal wail of despair, and Lorraine collapsed with her while Ryan punched the wall in a fit of total impotence. Their status and expensive luggage had crumbled to dust, leaving them completely helpless in the one moment that truly mattered. Simone lay in a heap on the floor while her breathing remained ragged and broken, and she looked around with a wild gaze at the weeping mother and the husband who was staring blankly at the hole he had punched in the wall. They were all useless in this moment of crisis, and her father was nothing more than a gray statue of defeat who could not save his own grandson. Then her swollen red eyes snapped across the room and locked onto me as I stood perfectly still near the entrance with Marcus, observing the scene without saying a single word. Her mind began making a new and desperate calculation based on the presidential suite and the Maybach and the calm way Marcus had dismissed her earlier along with the $1 billion and that black card. She did not stand up, but instead she scrambled across the cold, sterile tile of the emergency room floor on her hands and knees like a desperate animal. She reached me and grabbed the hem of my pants with a grip that felt like a steel trap while screaming my name and begging for help because she knew I had the money. I looked down at the top of her head and her expensive blonde highlights while feeling nothing but a vast and cold emptiness. She shrieked about the black card and begged me to pay the doctor to save Jadon while promising she would do anything and apologizing repeatedly for everything she had done. Ryan snapped out of his stupor and rushed over to join the plea with a voice that was cracking as all his former smugness and the Motel 6 condescension vanished. He begged me to help and swore they would pay me back every penny once they figured out a way to find the money. I did not look at them, but instead I looked past their graveling faces at my parents, who were standing frozen as their entire foundation of superiority shattered. They were forced in silent and agonizing humiliation to pin their only hope on the daughter they had thrown away like trash. Simone continued to cling to my leg, and her sobs echoed through the cold room while my mother wept silently and my father stared at me with a face of defeated humiliation. My face remained blank, and I felt no triumph or pity because I was operating with a sharp and absolute clarity. I slowly and deliberately peeled Simone's fingers off my leg and stepped around her as if she were a piece of furniture to walk toward Dr. Evans. I ignored the desperate stares of my family and spoke to the doctor with a professional voice that was completely devoid of emotion. I repeated his statement about Dr. Reed being the only expert, and then I interrupted him to propose a different plan than transporting the unstable patient. I asked what would happen if we could bring the surgeon and his entire team and specialized equipment here to this hospital, instead of moving Jadon. The doctor stared at me as if I were insane and explained that mobilizing an entire private critical care surgical team from Baltimore was logistically impossible in such a short time. I did not bother to answer him, but simply turned to Marcus, who was already pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. I told him to call Dr. Reed directly using my authorization, and to tell him it was a code or a personal emergency. Behind me, I heard my father choke out a sound as he finally realized the weight of the name Oratech and my true position. Marcus spoke into the phone with a calm and authoritative voice as he reached Alistair and explained the urgent trauma involving my nephew at Hilton Head. He told the surgeon that the company jet would be at his private hangar in 30 minutes and that he should bring his entire team and all required equipment. Marcus ended the call and turned to the doctor to explain that the Oratech Gulfstream G700 was already on its way to retrieve the surgical team. He stated they would be airborne within the hour and would land in approximately 90 minutes to begin the procedure. Marcus then looked at my father with a brief and dismissive glance before announcing that Oratech would assume all financial responsibility for the transport and the surgery. He told my father that he would not see a single bill for any of it. Dr. Evans looked completely stunned by this display of power and simply nodded before hurrying back into the trauma bay to prepare for the arrival of the world's best surgeon. A deafening silence fell over the corridor as my sister and her husband and my parents stood there frozen with faces showing a grotesque mixture of shock and dawning understanding. The entire narrative they had built for years about my failure and my status as a charity worker had been shattered by a single phone call. They realized that the daughter they had abandoned was the only person with the power to save the child's life. She had done it with a level of influence they could not even begin to comprehend or access. My mother was the first to speak in a trembling whisper, and she stared at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. She stammered that the caller had referred to me as the Chief Technology Officer, and I finally turned to look at her tear-streaked face. I looked at my father's ashen expression and Ryan's blank stare, and I spoke with a quiet and steady voice that held no anger. I told my mother she was right in the lobby when she said I was all alone and that I had learned long ago how to take care of myself. Then I turned my gaze to Simone, who was still on the floor with eyes wide with shame and horror. I told her she was also right when she said we were not a real family, because a real family would never abandon one of their own and tell them to find a Motel 6. I did not wait for any of them to reply because there was nothing left to say to people like them. I turned my back on their shame and their useless apologies and walked down the corridor to a large window that overlooked the hospital helipad. I stood there alone and watched the darkening sky as I waited for the help that I had summoned to arrive. This story serves as a powerful reminder that self-worth must come from within, rather than the validation of those who refuse to see your value. My family dismissed me as a failure because I did not fit their shallow definition of success, and they abandoned me in a moment of public humiliation. But when their world collapsed in a true crisis, their money and status were completely useless, and they were forced to beg the person they had thrown away. You must always be careful how you treat others, because the person you mock today might be the only one with the power to save you tomorrow. The minutes that followed the mobilization of the medical team felt like an eternity stretched thin across the cold fluorescent hallway of the hospital. I stood at the window and watched the horizon for the flicker of landing lights, while behind me the heavy silence of my family felt like a physical weight in the air. My father Charles was no longer the man who commanded boardrooms with a roar, because he was now just a shadow leaning against a wall with his eyes fixed on the floor in a state of absolute defeat. My mother Lorraine continued to weep into a silk handkerchief that was now ruined by the reality of a situation she could not charm her way out of, while Simone and Ryan sat like broken dolls on the waiting room chairs. The irony was not lost on me that the very wealth and status they had used as a club to beat me into submission had failed them when the stakes were life and death. They had spent 3 decades measuring my worth by the lack of a corporate title or a flashy car, while I was quietly building an empire that was now their only lifeline. The sound of a distant turbine began to thrum against the glass, and I knew that the Oratech jet was nearing the regional airport, where a helicopter would be waiting to ferry the team directly to us. Marcus stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, and his presence was a silent reminder that I was no longer the girl who needed to beg for a seat at their table because I had built my own table in a different world entirely. I could feel my father's gaze on my back, and I knew he wanted to speak or to offer some kind of apology that would make him feel less like the man who had just tried to use his daughter as a bank. But I did not turn around because there was no apology that could erase the memory of him staring at the ocean while I was told there was no room for me in the family. Simone finally stood up, and her movements were shaky as she approached me with a look of such profound shame that she could barely meet my eyes. She tried to whisper my name, but I kept my focus on the helipad outside because her voice only reminded me of her laughter in the lobby when she suggested I stay at a Motel 6. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew into a deafening roar that vibrated through the floorboards and the glass of the window. A team of people in dark flight suits jumped out before the rotors had even stopped, and they were carrying specialized crates of equipment that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Among them was Dr. Alastair Reed, who was a man whose hands held the power to fix the shattered spine of a 3-year-old boy. As the team rushed through the double doors, I saw Dr. Evans meet them with a look of pure awe, because he knew he was witnessing a level of medical intervention that usually only happened for world leaders. My family watched in stunned silence as the experts I had summoned swept past them without a second glance, because in this world they were the ones who were invisible. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the air in the room felt different as the labels of failure and disappointment were stripped away and replaced by the undeniable truth of my success. I watched the trauma bay doors close behind the surgical team, and I knew that Jadin was now in the best hands on the planet because I had made it so. My mother stepped toward me and reached out a hand to touch my shoulder, but I stepped away before she could make contact because I was not ready to be her daughter again. I told her that she should go sit with Simone because the real family needed to stay together while I handled the logistics of the operation. The words were a bitter medicine, but they were necessary because they needed to understand that you cannot discard a person and then expect them to be your anchor the moment the storm hits. I turned back to the window and looked at the dark sky while Marcus came to stand beside me. And he didn't say anything because he knew that the silence was the only thing I had left that felt honest. We stood there together as the keepers of a billion-dollar secret that had finally been laid bare in the most tragic way imaginable. The night was far from over, but for the first time in 32 years, I was the one who was standing tall, while the rest of the Whitfields were left to pick up the pieces of a narrative that had finally reached its end. The hours that followed the arrival of the surgical team were defined by a heavy and suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the very air in the hospital waiting room. I remained at the window and watched the flickering lights of the city while the rhythmic thrum of medical machinery served as the only soundtrack to our collective misery. Behind me, my family was a collection of broken figures who had finally been stripped of their pretenses and their expensive labels. My father Charles sat with his head in his hands, and he looked like a man who had realized that his entire life was built on a foundation of sand that had finally washed away. My mother Lorraine was a ghost of her former self as she sat huddled in a corner with her ruined linen dress, serving as a bitter reminder of the vacation that had turned into a nightmare. Simone and Ryan were silent, and their eyes were fixed on the double doors of the trauma bay with a desperation that was almost physical in its intensity. The irony was sharp and cold because they were now waiting for a miracle that was only possible because of the daughter they had treated as an inconvenience. Every few minutes a nurse or an assistant would hurry past with a look of focused urgency, and my family would lean forward with a frantic hope that was always met with a professional nod or a request for more space. Marcus stood beside me like a silent guardian, and his presence was a constant reminder that I was no longer bound by the rules of the Whitfield family narrative. He had been the one to see my potential when my own father saw only a charity worker, and he had been the partner who helped me build a reality that was now more powerful than anything Charles had ever achieved. I thought about the irony of the black card and the Maybach and the private jet, because these were the symbols of success that my family worshipped, and yet they were now the very tools being used to save the life of the child they loved. I wondered if my father felt the sting of humiliation as he realized that the technology he had dismissed at Thanksgiving was now the very thing managing the logistics of his grandson's survival. I wondered if my mother felt the weight of her words in the lobby when she said I was not part of the real family, while she sat in a hospital waiting for my money to pay for her grandson's future. The passage of time felt distorted, as if we were suspended in a void where the only things that mattered were the steady hands of Dr. Reid and the resilience of a 3-year-old boy. I did not turn to look at them because I knew that if I did, I would see the same look of groveling dependency that had replaced their former arrogance. I was not interested in their gratitude or their apologies because I knew they were born out of a need for survival rather than a genuine change of heart. The night outside was deep and dark, but the hospital was a blaze of artificial light that kept the reality of our situation at bay. I thought about the audit and my father's frozen accounts and the way he had begged for a loan on the yacht. He had been willing to sell his pride for a check, and yet he had been unwilling to give his daughter a room in a hotel. The hypocrisy was a poison that had infected our family for 32 years, and the surgery was the only thing that felt clean and honest in this entire ordeal. I watched as a technician wheeled a tray of specialized sensors toward the trauma bay, and I recognized the Oratech logo on the side of the equipment. It was a piece of hardware that I had helped design, and the sight of it in this sterile environment was a strange kind of vindication. My work was no longer a little charity or a save-the-world project, but was instead the literal difference between life and death for my nephew. I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me as the adrenaline began to fade, and I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window. I was 32 years old, and I had achieved more than my family could ever dream of, but I was still the little girl who wanted her father to look at her with pride. That little girl had finally died in the lobby of the sanctuary resort, and the woman who stood in her place was someone they did not know and could never control. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder and told me I should sit down, but I shook my head because I needed to remain standing as the anchor for the family that had tried to set me adrift. We were waiting for the doors to open and for the verdict to be delivered, and the suspense was a physical pain that throbbed in my chest. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was now 2 hours since the surgery began, and the world outside was beginning to stir with the first hints of dawn. The real family was huddled together in a mass of weeping and silent prayer, while I stood apart as the stranger who had saved them all. The ultimate lesson was clear because status and wealth are nothing more than illusions when compared to the value of human connection and the power of individual character. I had found my worth in a garage in Palo Alto and in the lines of code that now governed global logistics, while they had lost theirs in the pursuit of labels and invitations. The doors of the trauma bay finally began to swing open, and the sound of the pneumatic hiss was like a gunshot in the silent room. Dr. Reed stepped out, and he was still wearing his blue scrubs, and he looked tired, but his eyes held a glimmer of something that looked like success. My family surged forward like a single organism, and their voices were a cacophony of desperate questions and frantic pleas. I remained where I was, and I let the distance between us serve as a final boundary that they would never be allowed to cross again. The daughter they had mocked was now the only reason they had a grandson to hold, and that was a debt they could never hope to repay with money or words. Dr. Reed stood before the gathered members of the Whitfield family, and the exhausted surgeon pulled down his mask while his weary eyes searched for me near the window before looking at the frantic faces of my parents and sister. He spoke with a voice that was low, but carried the weight of absolute authority, as he informed us that the surgery had been a success, and that they had managed to stabilize the cervical spine and relieve the life-threatening pressure on the brain. Simone let out a sound that was half sob and half scream as she collapsed into Ryan's arms, while my mother Lorraine sank into a chair with her hands clasped over her heart in a gesture of pure relief. The doctor explained that while the procedure went as well as could be expected, Jadon still faced a long and arduous road to recovery that would require months of specialized physical therapy and around-the-clock monitoring. My father Charles tried to step forward to regain his role as the patriarch by thanking the doctor and mentioning that he would ensure the hospital was taken care of, but Dr. Reed simply looked at him with a cool professional detachment. The surgeon noted that the only reason he was standing in this regional hospital at all was because of the immediate mobilization of resources by the Chief Technology Officer of Oratech, and he made it clear that my intervention was the sole factor in the child's survival. I watched from a distance as my family members turned their gazes toward me, and their expressions were no longer filled with the smug superiority of the hotel lobby, but were instead clouded by a suffocating layer of shame and unpayable debt. They realized in that sterile room that every breath Jadden took from that moment forward was a gift provided by the daughter they had deemed unworthy of a hotel room. Ryan looked at me with eyes that were red and hollow as he whispered a thank you that felt brittle and small compared to the magnitude of his earlier cruelty when he suggested I find a Motel 6. I did not acknowledge his words because I knew that his gratitude was a product of his relief rather than a genuine recognition of my humanity. Marcus remained by my side like an unbreakable pillar, and he looked at the scene with the same analytical calm that he used to evaluate global markets because he knew that the power dynamic of this family had been permanently rewritten in blood and titanium. The morning sun was now fully visible through the window, and it cast long shadows across the floor that seemed to separate me from the rest of the Whitfields, who were huddled together in a mass of fragile emotion. My father approached me with slow and hesitant steps, while looking like a man who had finally realized that his daughter was a giant whose shadow he had been living in without even knowing it. He tried to reach out to touch my arm, as if he could mend 32 years of neglect with a single gesture, but I remained as still and cold as the marble in the resort lobby. I told him that the logistics for Jadden's transfer to a private recovery wing had already been handled, and that Oratech would continue to cover every expense related to the boy's care, because I refused to let my nephew suffer for the financial failures of his grandfather. Charles flinched at my words as the truth of his frozen accounts and his desperate plea for a loan on the yacht came back to haunt him in the presence of the man who was actually his superior. I looked at my mother, who was watching us with a face that was a mask of grief and dawning realization, as she finally saw the woman I had become in the 6 years I spent building an empire while they ignored my existence. I told her that she should stay with Simone and help her through the coming weeks, because they were the real family they had always talked about, and they needed to learn how to be one without the crutch of my father's status. The finality of my statement hung in the air like a blade, and I saw Simone turn her face away because she could not bear the weight of her own actions reflecting back at her from my eyes. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life I felt completely free of the need for their validation or their love, because I had proven that my worth was independent of their narrow definitions. I turned away from the huddle of my relatives and walked toward the exit with Marcus, and the sound of my heels on the hospital tile was firm and decisive. I did not look back at the people who had abandoned me because I was moving toward a future that was entirely of my own making, where I was no longer an obligation, but the architect of my own destiny. The ultimate lesson was that a family is not defined by blood or shared vacations, but by the loyalty and respect shown in the moments when there is nothing to be gained from it. They had failed that test, and while I had saved the child, I had also closed the door on the people who only saw my value when it came with a $1 billion price tag. The final chapter of this ordeal began as I walked away from the hospital ward and left the suffocating weight of my family's history behind me in that sterile corridor. I moved through the automatic doors and into the cool, crisp air of the early morning, where the world was just beginning to wake up to a day that felt entirely different from any I had ever known before. Behind me, the Whitfields remained trapped in a reality of their own making, where they were forced to reconcile their shallow arrogance with the absolute truth of their failure as a family unit. My sister Simone and her husband Ryan would spend the coming months in a state of perpetual debt and gratitude toward the sister they had tried to erase from their lives, while my parents would have to face the mirror every morning and see the faces of people who had prioritized status over their own flesh and blood. My father Charles would eventually have to navigate the ruins of his company and his frozen accounts without the safety net of my wealth, because I had made it clear that while I would save the child, I would not save the man who had abandoned me. I felt a profound sense of closure as I climbed into the back of the Maybach one last time and saw Marcus watching me with a look of quiet respect, that meant more than any 1,000 apologies from my relatives ever could. We drove away from the hospital and toward the private dock where the Aura was waiting to take us back to the world we had built together in the shadows of Palo Alto and the boardrooms of the Pentagon. I thought about the ultimate lesson of this journey, which was that your self-worth must never be anchored to the opinions of people who are committed to misunderstanding you for the sake of their own ego. My family had spent 32 years trying to convince me that I was a failure because I chose a path of service and substance rather than one of flashy consumerism and empty titles. They had mocked my little charity and my Save the World job without ever realizing that the brain they dismissed was the same one designing the systems that kept their world turning. They had abandoned me in a hotel lobby because they thought I was a burden, and yet they found themselves begging at my feet the moment the true burden of life and death landed on their shoulders. This was a powerful reminder to be careful how you treat others, because the person you mock today might be the only one with the power to save you tomorrow, and you may find yourself needing a miracle from the very person you deemed a mistake. I realized that my secret was never really about the money or the billion-dollar valuation, but about the peace of knowing who I am without needing anyone else to validate it for me. I had kept my success hidden to see if they could love me for just being Monique, and their failure of that test was the greatest gift they could have ever given me because it set me free. I was no longer the disorganized daughter or the charity worker or the disappointment, but instead I was the architect of my own life and the savior of the next generation of our family. As the yacht pulled away from the Hilton Head shoreline and the sun began to climb higher into the sky, I felt the last of the resentment wash away into the salt water. I was 32 years old, and I had everything I had ever worked for, and more importantly, I had the clarity to know exactly who deserved to be at my table. My family had chosen the Motel 6 for me, and in doing so, they had permanently checked themselves out of my life. I looked at the vast horizon and the endless possibilities of the future, and I smiled, because for the first time in 32 years, I was finally home within myself. Outro, this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.